Elena had worked as a maid for the wealthy family for years. Her daily routine was predictable, just like the grand estate she tended to. The mansion, with its sprawling gardens, marble floors, and golden chandeliers, always seemed like a picture-perfect home. Everything seemed to run smoothly, but as Elena went about her work, she started to notice something odd. The wife, Isabella, was always inside the house, rarely leaving. It wasn't unusual for someone to stay home, of course, but Isabella's behavior seemed strange. Elena had seen the way people looked at her when she walked into the room. The million-dollar smile, the perfect hair, and the elegant outfits. Isabella appeared flawless, as if she lived a life everyone else would envy. Yet, as the days passed, Elena grew curious. She had spent countless hours cleaning, organizing, and running errands throughout the mansion, but she had rarely seen Isabella leave the house. She would stay in her study, reading or working on something, or she'd retire to her bedroom with the door always closed. At first, Elena didn't think much of it. Maybe Isabella was simply a private person. But the more she thought about it, the more questions came to her mind. Why didn't Isabella go out? Why didn't she meet with anyone? Friends, family, or even neighbors? Victor, Isabella's husband, was always going out to business meetings or social events. The couple's life seemed perfect to anyone who looked from the outside. They had wealth, power, and a beautiful home. But something felt off to Elena. She couldn't shake the feeling that Isabella wasn't as happy as she seemed. The more Elena observed, the more she realized that Isabella's life wasn't as free as it appeared. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when Elena would catch glimpses of sadness in Isabella's eyes. Sometimes, when she would walk past Isabella's study, she would see her staring out of the window, her gaze distant, lost in thought. It was as though she was longing for something beyond the walls of the mansion. Elena couldn't help but feel a sense of pity for her. One afternoon, while Elena was dusting the shelves in the living room, she overheard a conversation between Victor and Isabella. The words weren't loud enough to make out completely, but Elena could sense the tension in their voices. Victor's tone was harsh, and Isabella sounded almost defensive. Elena's curiosity piqued. What could be happening behind the closed doors of that beautiful house? The argument ended quickly, but the weight of it stayed with Elena. It was the first time she had heard anything that didn't fit the picture of the perfect marriage they portrayed. Days went by, and Elena's thoughts kept returning to Isabella. She had always admired her beauty, grace, and elegance, but now she was starting to see things differently. There was more to Isabella's life than met the eye. But Elena had no proof, just a growing sense of unease. She had seen people trapped by their circumstances before, but she had never imagined it could happen to someone as seemingly perfect as Isabella. The question lingered in Elena's mind. Why did Isabella never leave the house? What was she hiding, or worse, what was keeping her there? As days passed, Elena found herself thinking more and more about Isabella. There was something about the way she lived her life that seemed wrong, though Elena couldn't quite put her finger on it. Whenever she was in the house, working or running errands, she couldn't help but notice that Isabella hardly ever left her study or her bedroom. She had no visitors, no phone calls from friends, no invitations to events. While everyone else in the house went about their day, whether it was Victor heading out for meetings or the staff handling daily chores, Isabella stayed behind those closed doors. Elena had been working at the mansion long enough to know that things weren't always as they seemed. She had watched the perfect, glamorous world they presented to outsiders, but something about Isabella's silence made Elena uneasy. As the days turned into weeks, Elena started to see patterns that couldn't be ignored. There were moments when Isabella would look out the window, her eyes filled with longing, as though the outside world called to her. But then she would pull away from the glass, almost as if ashamed of the thought of leaving her gilded cage. One afternoon, as Elena was passing the hallway, she overheard a soft murmur coming from the other side of the door. She froze. The voices were low but clear enough to hear. Isabella and Victor were talking again, but this time there was something different. The tension in their words was sharper, like two people who had been pretending for far too long. Isabella's voice wavered with emotion as she tried to defend herself, but Victor's responses were cold, even dismissive. "Why won't you listen to me?" Isabella's voice cracked. "I'm not happy like this. I need to see the world outside." Victor's reply was firm. "You have everything you need right here. There's no reason to go anywhere." Elena felt a shiver run down her spine as she quietly continued on her way. The conversation had ended, but the unease in the air lingered long after. Elena knew that there was more to this marriage than what appeared on the surface. What could Victor mean when he said there was no reason for Isabella to leave the house? Was he keeping her inside against her will? That night, Elena found herself lying awake, turning over the pieces of the puzzle in her mind. She knew something was wrong, but it was hard to know exactly what. There were no obvious signs of abuse or mistreatment, but she could feel the tension in the air whenever Isabella was around. There was an invisible wall surrounding her, keeping her locked in a world that seemed far too perfect to be real. Elena couldn't help but feel empathy for Isabella. She had the wealth, the beauty, and the life that so many people dreamed of, yet she seemed trapped in a prison of her own making. Was it possible that she was simply a prisoner in her own home? That thought haunted Elena as she continued her work, never losing sight of the strange reality that had started to unfold before her. One afternoon, as Elena was busy cleaning in the attic, something caught her eye. While sorting through a box of old family items, she stumbled upon a stack of worn-out journals. The faded covers looked like they had been sitting there for years, forgotten in the clutter of the attic. The temptation to take a peek was too strong, so she carefully opened one of the journals, unsure of what she might find inside. The pages were filled with Isabella's handwriting, neat and elegant. At first, the words seemed harmless enough. Small notes about daily life, occasional mentions of her husband, Victor. But as Elena read on, she began to see a different side of Isabella, a side she had never expected. The early entries talked about Isabella's life before she married Victor, her hopes, her dreams, her passions. She had once been full of ambition, with a desire to travel, explore the world, and pursue her own career. But as the pages turned, Elena noticed a shift in the tone of Isabella's writing. The entries grew darker. There were mentions of her isolation, her growing distance from the world outside the mansion. She wrote about how Victor had promised her a life of luxury and security, but slowly, those promises had turned into a gilded cage. At first, it had seemed like the perfect life, a house full of servants, fine clothes, and lavish dinners. But over time, Isabella began to feel like a prisoner in her own home. She wrote about the walls closing in around her, how she could no longer see the person she once was. Elena's heart went out to Isabella as she continued reading. The journals described how, after their marriage, Victor's behavior began to change. At first, it was small things, little requests here and there, then subtle control over where Isabella went and who she spoke to. As time went on, those requests grew into demands, and soon, Isabella found herself retreating more and more into the mansion. There were notes about how Victor would discourage her from leaving the house, even for something as simple as meeting a friend. Slowly, the woman she had once been seemed to fade away, replaced by someone who was constantly afraid of what would happen if she tried to break free. The deeper Elena read, the more she realized how trapped Isabella truly was. She had never been allowed to live for herself. Everything she did had been dictated by Victor's wants and needs. What seemed like a luxurious life was, in fact, a life of control and confinement. Isabella had written, in one of her last entries, "I sometimes wonder if I'll ever be able to leave this place, but I'm too scared to try." Elena felt a pang of guilt as she closed the journal. She had no idea that Isabella's life was so different from what she had thought. What appeared to be a perfect marriage was, in reality, a partnership built on control, fear, and manipulation. It was clear to Elena now that Isabella wasn't just a woman who preferred staying at home. She was a woman who had been forced to stay behind closed doors, trapped in a life that was far from the one she had once dreamed of. The discovery weighed heavily on Elena's heart. She had always respected Isabella from a distance, admiring her beauty and grace, but now she saw a woman who was struggling to survive in a life that was suffocating her. Elena felt the urgency to do something, anything, to help Isabella, but she had no idea where to begin. The mystery of why Isabella never left the house had started to unravel, but now a bigger question remained. How could she break free from the life that Victor had created for her? One afternoon, as Elena was dusting off a set of antique vases in the living room, she heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. She quickly turned to see Isabella standing at the entrance of the room. The moment their eyes met, Isabella's face softened, and she gave Elena a small, almost imperceptible smile. Elena hadn't expected to see her outside of her study or bedroom. It was rare for Isabella to come down into the main part of the house, and even rarer for her to approach Elena directly. "Good afternoon, Miss Isabella," Elena said politely, trying to act as if nothing was unusual, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the air between them. Isabella gave a slight nod but didn't speak for a moment. Elena could see that her eyes, which were usually distant, were now focused, as if she was thinking carefully about what to say. "I've been meaning to talk to you," Isabella said, her voice soft but filled with an unspoken urgency. Elena felt her heart race a little, sensing that something was different today. Isabella was never one to engage in casual conversations, and certainly not about personal matters. Elena paused for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She had always been careful to stay in the background, never prying into the life of the family she worked for. But today, Isabella's quiet demeanor seemed to pull her in. Something about her presence felt vulnerable, almost as if she wanted to say something but was holding back. "What's on your mind, Miss Isabella?" Elena asked, trying to keep her tone neutral, though the question carried a sense of genuine curiosity. Isabella took a deep breath, her shoulders slightly tensing as she exhaled. She stepped into the room a little further, her eyes avoiding Elena's for a moment, as though she was wrestling with her thoughts. Then, with a shaky sigh, she turned back to Elena and spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've probably noticed that I rarely leave the house," Isabella began. Elena felt her pulse quicken, unsure of where this conversation was going. "I don't want you to think I don't enjoy your company, or that I'm trying to avoid the staff. It's not like that at all." Elena stood still, waiting for her to continue. Isabella paused, her gaze flickering toward the window, where the sunlight streamed in, casting a warm glow on the room. Her expression seemed far away, as if she were lost in a memory. "I've been trapped here," Isabella confessed, almost in a whisper, "not just by the walls of the house, but by promises and expectations, and sometimes I wonder if I will ever escape." Elena's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected Isabella to open up like this. All this time, she had thought Isabella's isolation was a matter of choice. Perhaps she was just a private person, someone who found comfort in solitude. But now, hearing her words, Elena could see that something far deeper was at play. Isabella seemed to hesitate for a moment, unsure whether to continue. The tension in the air was palpable. Elena could see the weight of her emotions, the years of frustration and longing that had built up inside her, and it made her heart ache. "It's not just about being alone," Isabella said softly, almost as though she were speaking more to herself than to Elena. "It's about being kept here. I never wanted this life. I never wanted to be a prisoner in my own home." Elena's mind raced as she processed Isabella's words. The way she spoke hinted at a deeper pain, something more than just the ordinary isolation that came with wealth. But what was keeping her here? Why couldn't she leave? Elena had more questions than answers now, but one thing was clear. Isabella was not simply choosing to stay inside. Something, or someone, was holding her back. As Isabella turned and began to walk away, she stopped for a brief moment, glancing over her shoulder. "I hope you understand, Elena," she said quietly before disappearing down the hallway. Elena stood there, speechless, her heart heavy with the weight of the confession. She hadn't expected Isabella to open up to her like that. Now she was left with a new understanding of the woman she had worked for all these years, but it also left her with a question that gnawed at her. What could she do to help Isabella escape from the invisible prison she had been living in? The next few days passed quietly, but Elena's thoughts were consumed by the conversation she had with Isabella. The words echoed in her mind, and she couldn't shake the image of Isabella standing there, so vulnerable and open for the first time in years. Elena found herself looking at Isabella in a new light, but she still didn't fully understand what was keeping her trapped in the house. There had to be something more, something deeper. One afternoon, Elena was dusting off the bookshelves in the study when she noticed Isabella sitting by the large window, staring out into the distance. Her gaze was fixed, as though she were lost in thought. But there was something different in her posture. Isabella's usual calm, almost detached demeanor was gone, replaced by a quiet restlessness. For a moment, Elena almost hesitated to approach, but then something inside her urged her to speak. She took a few tentative steps toward the window, her heart racing a little. "Miss Isabella, are you all right?" Elena asked softly. Isabella turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting Elena's with a mixture of sadness and exhaustion. "I was just thinking," Isabella said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "thinking about what my life could have been if things had been different." Elena could tell that this was more than just idle daydreaming. There was a deep longing in Isabella's voice, one that spoke of a life unfulfilled, of dreams left behind. Elena's heart ached for her. She wanted to help, to understand more about what was keeping Isabella confined in this mansion, but Isabella's reluctance to share had always been a barrier. "I never wanted this," Isabella continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I never wanted to be stuck here, in this beautiful prison. It seemed like a dream at first, but now I don't know how to escape it." She paused, as though choosing her words carefully. "Victor, he made promises, promises of freedom and happiness. But those promises have only turned into chains. I can't even remember the last time I left the house." Elena felt a pang of sympathy. She had always wondered why Isabella never left, why she never took part in the world outside the mansion. But now, hearing the pain in her voice, it became clear that it wasn't just a choice. It was something far more complicated, something beyond Elena's understanding. Isabella took a deep breath, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. She looked at Elena with a kind of quiet desperation. "I used to be so full of life, Elena. I had dreams. I wanted to travel, to see the world, to make a difference. But now I'm just stuck here, stuck in this gilded cage, and I don't know how to get out." Elena's heart broke for her. She had spent so many years working in this mansion, focusing on her tasks and keeping her head down. But now, seeing Isabella in this light, Elena realized that there was more to her story than she had ever imagined. Victor's name lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. What kind of man would trap his wife in such a way? Elena had seen the way he treated Isabella, always distant, always controlling. But she had never fully understood the extent of his control until now. Isabella's life wasn't just limited to the house. It was confined by Victor's power and the promises he had made. Elena stood there in silence, unsure of what to say. She wanted to offer comfort, but the truth was that she didn't know how. She was just a maid, after all, and Isabella was the wife of a wealthy man, someone far above her in status. Still, something stirred inside Elena, a desire to help, to find a way for Isabella to reclaim her life. "I don't know how I can help, Miss Isabella," Elena said, her voice soft but sincere. "But if you ever want to talk or need anything, I'm here." Isabella gave her a faint, sad smile. "Thank you, Elena. I think I just need someone to listen for now." Elena nodded, but as she turned to leave, the thought that had been growing in her mind became impossible to ignore. There had to be a way to get Isabella out of this situation. Elena didn't know how yet, But she was determined to find a way to help Isabella escape from the prison she had been trapped in for so long. Elena couldn't stop thinking about what Isabella had said. The more she reflected on it, the more she realized how trapped Isabella truly was. The woman had opened up in a way she never had before, revealing the deep loneliness and desperation she had been hiding behind the walls of her grand mansion. Elena felt a growing sense of urgency to help her, but how could she? What could she possibly do? She was just the maid, a servant in a house full of wealth and privilege. But as the days passed, the thought of Isabella's isolation continued to weigh on Elena's heart. She knew something had to change, that Isabella couldn't keep living like this. One evening, while cleaning the study, Elena's eyes wandered across the desk, and there, lying partially hidden beneath some papers, she saw it. A thick stack of official-looking documents. The title on the top page caught her eye. Legal Agreement. Elena's curiosity got the better of her, and she carefully reached over, picking up the papers. Her hands trembled slightly as she began to flip through them. The legal language was dense, but one thing was clear. These documents were about Isabella's confinement. Elena's eyes widened as she read the terms. It was an agreement that Victor had made with Isabella when they first married, a binding contract that restricted Isabella's freedom. As she read, it became clear that Isabella had signed away her right to leave the house or even make certain decisions without Victor's approval. At first, it seemed like a regular agreement, legal terms about managing the estate and taking care of the property. But the deeper Elena went into the pages, the more she realized how controlling it really was. Victor had essentially bound Isabella to the house, making it impossible for her to leave, meet anyone, or even make her own choices about her life. Elena felt her stomach churn as she processed the information. She couldn't believe what she was reading. All this time, she had thought Isabella was just reclusive, maybe even a little aloof. But now, it was clear that she was trapped. This was no choice of hers. The more Elena read, the more horrified she became. The legal documents spelled out the harsh realities of Isabella's situation. Victor had manipulated her into signing the contract by promising a life of luxury and security, but now those promises had become chains. Isabella was a prisoner in her own home, and Victor had the legal power to keep her there. Elena's mind raced as she realized just how serious the situation was. She felt a fire of determination spark within her. She couldn't stand by and let this happen. She had to help Isabella escape. But how? Elena wasn't sure where to start. The legal documents were clear. Victor had a tight grip on Isabella's life, and breaking free would be anything but easy. But something in Elena refused to back down. She couldn't just let Isabella continue living in this gilded cage. There had to be a way out, and Elena was determined to find it. She carefully put the documents back where she had found them, her mind swirling with ideas. She needed help, and she knew she couldn't do this alone. But where could she turn for advice? How could she help Isabella without making things worse? As Elena continued her work, she couldn't stop thinking about Isabella's words. "I'm just stuck here," she had said. "I don't know how to escape." Elena knew she had to do something, no matter the cost. It wouldn't be easy, but for Isabella's sake, Elena was willing to risk everything. Elena couldn't shake the thought of what she had discovered in the study. The legal documents had opened her eyes to the truth behind Isabella's confinement. For days, she wrestled with the idea of what she could do next. The realization that Isabella's life wasn't her own, that she had been bound by a contract and forced to remain in a gilded cage, made Elena's blood boil. But what could a maid do to help? She was just a servant in the house, and Victor held all the power. Despite these thoughts, Elena couldn't let the situation go. She had to help Isabella escape. The urgency in Isabella's voice when she spoke about her trapped existence echoed in Elena's mind. Elena knew she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try. She had to find a way to help her. One evening, after everyone had retired to their rooms, Elena quietly made her way to the kitchen. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself any longer. She needed to find someone who could help them. Her heart raced as she thought about her next steps. As she walked through the empty halls, she realized how little she knew about the world outside the mansion. But she had heard things, rumors, whispers of people who had helped others break free from dangerous situations. Alina remembered one name. There was a lawyer, a woman who had helped a few of the staff members in the past with legal matters. Alina wasn't sure if she could trust her, but she had to try. She had no other choice. It was the only lead she had, and her instincts told her that this lawyer was the right person to turn to. The next day, after finishing her morning chores, Alina found a quiet moment to slip out of the house. She had to be careful, as Victor's guards were always watching the property, but Alina was determined. She left through a side entrance, staying in the shadows to avoid being seen. Her heart raced with each step, but she couldn't stop now. She knew Isabella's life was on the line. When she arrived at the lawyer's office, Alina's nerves were on edge. She hesitated for a moment at the door, unsure of what to expect. The lawyer, a kind woman named Clara, greeted her warmly when she explained her situation. Alina was cautious with her words, knowing she couldn't reveal too much. She explained that Isabella was trapped in a difficult situation, that she was being kept inside her home against her will, and that she needed help breaking free. Clara listened carefully, nodding as Alina spoke. After a long silence, Clara leaned forward. "You're right to be cautious," she said softly. "If what you say is true, then Isabella is in a very difficult position. These kinds of contracts are very tricky, but they're not impossible to break." Alina felt a surge of hope at Clara's words. There was a way out. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. Clara outlined a plan that would take time but could eventually free Isabella from her legal bindings. It involved gathering evidence, finding loopholes in the contract, and working discreetly to ensure that Victor wouldn't find out about their plan. Alina listened carefully, taking in every word. She knew this would be a delicate operation, but she was ready to do whatever it took. "Are you sure you can do this?" Clara asked, her voice filled with concern. "This is dangerous. If Victor finds out what you're doing, it could make things worse for her." Alina nodded firmly. "I can't stand by and do nothing. Isabella deserves to be free. I'll do whatever it takes to help her." Clara gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Then let's get started. It's going to take time, but we'll figure it out. You're doing the right thing." Alina left the lawyer's office with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would be difficult and dangerous, but for Isabella's sake, she was willing to take the risk. The plan wasn't foolproof, but it was their best chance, and no matter how hard it was, Alina was determined to help Isabella reclaim her freedom. The days following Alina's meeting with Clara were filled with quiet determination. Alina's mind raced as she prepared to put their plan into motion. She knew that it wouldn't be easy, and the stakes were high. Every decision she made had to be careful and precise. One wrong move, and Victor might find out. But she couldn't back down now. Isabella's future depended on it. Each night, after her work was done, Alina would return to the lawyer, Clara, to share updates and discuss the next steps. Together, they began gathering the evidence they needed: documents, letters, and any records they could find that would reveal the full extent of Isabella's situation. It was a slow and delicate process, and each time Alina returned to the mansion, she couldn't shake the worry that Victor would notice something was off. But despite the growing tension, Alina stayed focused. She spent long hours in the mansion, carefully watching for any signs that Isabella might be in danger, while also keeping a low profile. She had to keep the plan under wraps, so no one, especially Victor, could catch wind of what was happening. It was difficult, but she kept telling herself that it would all be worth it in the end. Then, one day, things began to fall into place. Clara managed to find a legal loophole in the agreement, a small detail that, if used correctly, could break the contract and free Isabella from the binding terms. It was a huge breakthrough, and Alina couldn't believe how close they were to succeeding. But there was still so much work to do. They needed to act quickly, before Victor figured out what was going on. Elena continued to visit Clara in secret, always careful to cover her tracks. She felt a sense of urgency building inside her, knowing that the moment of truth was approaching. Every conversation she had with Isabella seemed to carry more weight now. There were still moments when Isabella would stare out the window, her longing evident, but Elena could see that she was beginning to lose hope. It had been so long since she had felt free, and now that the possibility of escape was in sight, it almost felt like a dream to her. Finally, the day came when Clara had everything ready. The papers were prepared, the evidence was gathered, and the loophole was ready to be used. Elena's heart raced as she met with Clara one last time before taking the next step. "It's time," Clara said, looking at Elena with a mixture of resolve and caution. "This is the moment. Are you sure you're ready?" Elena nodded firmly. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the fear racing through her veins. Together, they made their move. Clara filed the necessary paperwork, and within hours, they received confirmation that the contract had been nullified. Isabella was free. The news was like a weight being lifted off Elena's shoulders. After all the risk, all the waiting, it was finally happening. When Elena told Isabella the news, Isabella's reaction was one of disbelief at first. She could hardly process it. "You did it?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Elena smiled warmly. "Yes. You're free now, Isabella. You don't have to stay here anymore." Isabella's eyes welled with tears, but there was something else: relief, joy, and hope. For the first time in years, she smiled fully, a smile that reached her eyes and radiated the freedom she hadn't known in so long. The next few days were a whirlwind. Isabella packed her things, and Elena made sure everything was in place for her to leave without raising suspicion. They had to move quickly, but every step brought them closer to Isabella's new life. With Clara's help, they secured a safe place for Isabella to go, somewhere far away from the mansion and the life she had been forced to live. On the day Isabella left, Elena stood at the gate, watching her go. She had helped Isabella escape, but she also knew this was a turning point for both of them. For Isabella, it was the beginning of a new chapter, a life where she could choose her own path. And for Elena, it was a moment of fulfillment, knowing that she had done the right thing, knowing that she had helped someone find freedom. Isabella turned to look back one last time, her face filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Elena," she said softly, before disappearing into the world beyond the mansion walls. As Elena stood there, watching her leave, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had taken a risk, faced her fears, and helped someone reclaim their life. And for that, she would always be proud.